Alright, so what we're doing today is like the second part, right, of that whole review I've made. What I'm going to do is at the very end of this, I'll end up combining the two parts into one like I've been doing the last couple exams. So you guys just have the entire PowerPoint all together into one space. So that way you don't have to like mess with two different parts because I know it can kind of get annoying a little bit. So I get that. Um, but yes, so like I said, mainly what we're doing today is just going over the stuff that was this week. Hopefully, I can get it done in a couple of hours. But it was like 6 lectures, so maybe not. I'm pretty sure I'll be able to finish in time though. But regardless, let's go ahead and get started. So first one, so I was talking about amino acid derivatives. Let me move this chat a little bit out of the way. All right, so amino acid derivatives. So this is Z-Ground's first one. Anyway, so the thing that I thought was important on this slide was having to kind of know the process of how like T3 and T4 are made. So what it says on this slide right up top, it says phenylalanine and tyrosine are like the precursor for thyroid hormones. Now that's like partially true. So tyrosine is like the direct precursor for thyroid hormones, while phenylalanine is more like the precursor for tyrosine. So it's kind of like if you drew an arrow in between these, right? You'd be like phenylalanine to tyrosine, then to thyroid hormones. So it's accurate the way she says it, but it's still a little different. So that's just a heads up about that. Now, yeah, what I figured was important is kind of just what she mentions here on the slide. Not really the pictures are super important, but they are helpful as far as like how the whole process kind of works. So you notice here that like the iodine gets kind of like brought in and incorporated here with these TGB molecules here. Yeah, thyroglobulin. Yeah, and then so that comes back out. That's like the whole process here, but she doesn't really go that much into detail, like I said. But anyway, so we'll just kind of look into this. So the thyroid follicular cells, right? They produce what this TGB is called, so that thyroglobulin protein, and that's secreted into colloid. So that colloid part's not really all that super important, but you do need to know that these thyroid follicular cells are what produce TGB and thyroid hormone, of course, using TGB. Anyway, so you have iodination, so that's basically just adding on iodine onto tyrosine residues of thyroglobulin. So you notice here that you have that iodine pump here on this side of so where the blood is, right? So you get that iodine from the blood. Normally from your diet is where most of this iodine comes from. It's going to be put, through here, so it goes into the cell, then goes back out into this colloid part. So that's what it means by colloid. It's kind of like the more inner part of these follicular cells. So it's kind of like their lumen, essentially. But anyway, so that iodine gets incorporated to TGB here. So that's how you have T3 and T4 being made, which is made using these, which first happens, right? You get that iodine being incorporated with TGB, which then forms these different molecules, these MITs or DITs. So MIT is this monoiodotyrosine. So of course that's only one iodine added on there. While you'd have DIT would be if you had two, right? Dietotyrosine. So that's what this picture is here. You notice there's two iodines on this, so that's a DIT. And then this one up here, this molecule right here would be a DIT as well. So this is technically two different DITs chained together. Now if you notice, right, then these two can get coupled together, and that's what forms your T4. Now if you were to combine a mono, so monoiodo, so MIT instead of a DIT, with a DIT, so you'd have 1 and 2 right together, and that's how you get T3. So that's how they're made, is because of this whole coupling reaction here, okay? And then after that's made, then it's basically just taken outside of the cell, and a lot of this stuff gets recycled. So this TGB, that you don't really run out of that because you keep getting that recycled back into the colloid over and over again. And then some of the T3, T4, the DITs and the MITs, they're also recycled as well. But for the most part, what you're going to be getting is like these T3s and T4s secreted outside of this follicular cell. So that's basically the whole process summed up. But I do like this picture here. I feel like it sums it up pretty well for you. But yeah. Now on to, I didn't really think there was like super anything like really high yield on here, but it does talk about like negative and positive feedback for this sort of thing. Not really any positive feedbacks are going on with this kind of mechanism here. So notice your TRH, that's going to be your what's being released by the hypothalamus, right? So that's like your very first one in this chain. And then that TRH is going to be stimulating TSH to be secreted from your pituitary gland, right? And so that's going to be your thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. And then your TSH is going to be acting on the thyroid itself, which is going to lead to secretion of T3 and T4, right? Which is exactly what it says here. So you not only do you get release, but it also triggers its synthesis as well. So you don't really get any T3 or T4 made unless you have this TSH saying, hey, I need it, right? And then, like I said, T3, T4 gets secreted by the thyroid for that. Now, if you notice, right, T3 does this whole negative feedback. So, and what you'll notice is, like among these slides and stuff, T3 is always the more active form of thyroid hormone. T4 doesn't really do a whole lot. It's kind of more of like a carrier kind of thing, so it can turn into T3 and become active, but it's kind of just the non-active kind of floating around in the blood type thyroid hormone, while T3 is going to be your more active form. So that T3, it's going to not only have its effect on the cells that it needs to do in order to like mess with metabolic rate, heart rate, things like that. So not only is it going to do those, but it can also do negative feedback on these ones I just mentioned, so TSH and TRH. So that's what these negative signs up here are for. Yeah. Graves' disease, this one is important, not only for this class, but you also run into it with histo if you guys haven't already done that. Maybe they included it on this test, I don't really know. They've kind of moved things around in that class, so I'm not too sure. But anyway, so Graves' disease, so always, like I say every time, if they mention diseases, just know it. Just know what caused the disease, like what kind of symptoms are associated with the disease, and if there's any kind of like specific mutations or anything mentioned, you have to know that. So with this case, you don't really have a mutation that's mentioned specifically, but it's more of an autoimmune disease, typically because of these IgG antibodies, these autoantibodies. So that's just autoimmune antibodies. So that's just basically antibodies that you make that attack your own tissues. Anyway, so these binding of IgG autoantibodies to TSH receptors on the thyroid gland. Now, if you remember what I said from this picture back here, TSH stimulates T3 and T4 synthesis and release, right? Now, you would think that these autoantibodies would be blocking TSH, but that's not the case with Graves' disease. Graves' disease is actually acting like TSH, except it's like a TSH that won't come off, essentially. So these TSH, it'll act like TSH, like I said, and it'll secrete excess T3 and T4 because it won't be able to let go. So it'll be like continuously causing T3 and T4 to be made and secreted. And so that's why you'll typically get things like a weight loss and a tachycardia, because your increased basal metabolic rate. That's what I always associate thyroid hormone with, and that always kind of helps me remember what it does. Because if you think about it, right, if you're going to be raising your metabolic rate, what kind of things would be going on with that, right? The way I kind of think about it is like somebody, in a way, it's like somebody that's kind of like exercising, and like, their metabolic rate would be going up because they're exercising, right? Now, if you think about it that way, you're like, well, what exactly kind of happens, right, if you're exercising, sort of thing, right? You'd be like, well, I have some weight loss and my heart rate goes high, right? So that's kind of the way I kind of associate the two together, as far as like what its job does and what kind of symptoms come together. So with that in mind, since I know T3 and T4 are high, then you're going to have a higher metabolic rate, which means you're going to be basically using up all of your storages, so therefore you're losing weight, and since of course you're increasing that rate, you need a lot more transport of these nutrients and stuff like that, right? And so therefore your tachycardia is going to go up for your to match that cardiac output that you need. And anyway, so why is TSH levels low in Graves' disease? Well, because according to your body, right, you already have tons of T3 and T4, right? And if you have tons of T3, remember that T3 inhibits the release of TSH and TRH. If you have tons of T3, then it's obviously going to cause your TSH levels to drop. So that's why it's low. But yeah, so that's a super important concept to understand. But yeah. T3, like I've already mentioned before, it's more potent than T4. And most of it's going to be T3 that's going to be circulating. And notice here that I already kind of mentioned this, but T4 can like deiodinate, so basically get rid of an iodine to turn into T3 via this deiodinase enzyme. It's kind of an important point to know, so I have it read for you. Corticosteroids, so they actually inhibit this deiodinase enzyme, so therefore you end up like forming only T4, so then you don't have any T3 being formed as much. Therefore, that would kind of decrease its action essentially, so decrease thyroid hormone action. So that's why you'd give corticosteroids to somebody with Graves' disease. But you don't really have to know anything about drugs in this case. I think it's more so just important to know maybe what corticosteroids might do, but I wouldn't think she would ask much about that. I think she would ask about T4 potentially becoming T3. I mean, that's something. And that to know that T3 is more common in the bloodstream than T4. Also, catecholamines here. So what are they, right? Epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine. What they actually do, for the most part, is serve as neurotransmitters in the CNS and as hormones in circulation in response to physiological stress. I don't know why I said physiological. Well, I guess physiological too, actually, but psychological is what they said. But yeah, so that's what these are. That's pretty much all you need to know. Alright, now I kind of already mentioned some of this before, so how phenylalanine is like the precursor for tyrosine. But tyrosine, therefore, is the precursor for dopamine. So once again, you can kind of draw arrows in between these, phenylalanine to tyrosine to dopamine. And so that's what you get over here on this picture on the left. So what the rate limiting step here is actually tyrosine hydroxylase. I didn't remember having to know like the specific rate limiting step or anything, but she did have these in bold here. I remember maybe there being a question on dopa decarboxylase or something like that, like one of these enzymes. I would also keep in mind here as well that she does like to ask about like when certain coenzymes are needed, or like especially vitamin B6. She likes to ask a lot about like when POP is used. So make sure you know that this dopa decarboxylase, which converts dopa to dopamine, make sure you know that it uses vitamin B6 as well. So that way, if you have a vitamin B6 deficiency, right, then you're not able to convert dopa to dopamine. So therefore, you wouldn't have enough dopamine, right? Which of course could be the result of something like Parkinson's disease, right? If you don't have enough dopamine. All right, and that's kind of what this is talking about here, right? But except Parkinson's disease is typically going to be a loss of dopaminergic neurons. So it's going to be typically a loss of these neurons that produce dopamine, not so much a genetic defect or a loss of vitamin B6 to make dopa, like that whole process. But of course, you could have similar symptoms, right? But it wouldn't be Parkinson's disease unless you had this loss of these dopaminergic neurons, or these neurons that produce dopamine, which, like, in this specific area, so I do have it underlined for you that I feel like is really important to know, is that this in the substantia nigra, because you hear it over and over again all the time. Also, another thing that I thought was important on here is Lewy bodies. So anytime you ever see Lewy bodies, you need to automatically think Parkinson's disease. Okay, so those two need to be just drawn, aligned together. May also be good to know kind of what Parkinson's disease looks like. So like how they have that tremor, especially in the extremities. Also, they have like gait issues, so ataxia. And then they also have just like generalized rigidity. So not only do they have like tremor, but it's just hard for them to kind of move. And then they also move very slowly, so bradykinesia. Anyway, on to the next bit. So norepinephrine and epinephrine biosynthesis. So this is kind of like an added on step to the one we've kind of already talked about here. So notice that this is basically a continuation of that other picture. So dopamine via dopamine beta hydroxylase, which requires vitamin C and copper, which I don't think she really asked anything about vitamin C or copper for that, because she tends to like bold stuff that's more important a lot of the times, so I didn't really make much of it. I don't remember her asking much about this, about vitamin C and copper needed in that. But anyway, so dopamine beta hydroxylase, using dopamine converts it to norepinephrine. So norepinephrine, and then norepinephrine can use this one down here that she doesn't even really mention. So there's another enzyme right here. But she does mention that you need to know, I would probably keep this in mind that you use SAM in order to do that. So this adenosylmethionine, I would keep in mind that you have to use SAM in order to form epinephrine. So it's kind of like how I mentioned earlier with the PLP or vitamin B6. It's kind of the same thing. So anytime she mentions like a biofactor, like a cofactor or coenzyme, I would also just keep in mind as well. But yeah, so SAM from that one, and then vitamin B6 from this slide. So yeah. All right, now on to melanin. I think she may ask a little bit as far as like. I don't think she really asks a whole lot about um, melanin like formation really. But I think she does ask about like if you had um, like melanin issues, like if you had basically no melanin. But I would also keep in mind here as well um, that let me see here. Yeah, genetic mutations in either tyrosine hydroxylase or other enzymes that convert tyrosine to melanin. So I would keep in mind at least tyrosine hydroxylase because that is a key enzyme in order to result in melanin. Anyway, so if you have genetic mutations in any of these enzymes that result from tyrosine turning into melanin, you can end up getting these symptoms here. So you can get like albinism, right? Or they suffer from lack of pigment, which is basically the same sort of thing as albinism. Hair. So it's kind of just describing what albinism is. So it may cause albinism or loss of melanin, right? Which they'll end up having basically no skin pigment or a lack of skin pigment, loss of not only pigment in the skin but in the hairs, the eyes. I'm sure you may or may not have seen like an albino person. So that's typically what they'll look like, right? It's some sort of genetic mutation within that pathway. Next thing here. So what I thought was important on here, if you remember the catecholamines, right, which we've already kind of mentioned, but just to bring it back up, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine, right? They actually utilize, so in order for those to be degraded, so broken down, right, you need MAO, so your monoamine oxidase, or COMT, so catecholamine O-methyltransferase, right? Those two are used in order to degrade those three, right? And also MAO is used by, so serotonin is also broken down by MAO, but we haven't got to that one yet, so I haven't mentioned it. And also, so you do have, so there are, I thought this was kind of important as well, and to kind of keep in mind, so reuptake inhibitors, right? Or MAO or COMT, right, could actually be used in depression and or Parkinson's, right? Because if you think about it, a lot of those, especially like serotonin, is associated with depression a lot more often. Some dopamine is also associated with that as well. But what they're kind of talking about, and as far as regards for dopamine, is more so Parkinson's, right? More so than depression in this case. Depression is going to be referred to, like I said, mainly as serotonin. So serotonin level being low. So if you think about it, right, if you're inhibiting its reuptake, or otherwise known as it's kind of restoring itself, then you're going to be allowing it to stay in the synapse longer, right? Which therefore could decrease the effects of depression, right? Especially with serotonin, and more so Parkinson in the case with dopamine. So it makes sense, right? If you know what and also you could have MAO or COMT inhibitors, right, which will just basically stop the breakdown of those. So it's not really a recycling type mechanism, but it's more so just making sure it's not broken down. But same result though, either way, right? You just have an increased amount of dopamine and or serotonin. Therefore, it could be allowed for treatment of depression and or Parkinson's. But yeah. Inactivation of catecholamines. So this goes a little bit more into detail about MAO and COMT. She didn't really ask much about this in specifics, but she does mention a little bit about this tyramine thing that's on the next slide here, but that's pretty important to know. But anyway, so, and I thought this little point here in red, I thought that was kind of important to know for the next slide. So MAO in the liver protects against ingestion of dietary biogenic amines, such as tyramine found in cheese. So tyramine and these other dietary biogenic amines, they're not something you want around much. Anyway, so now on to tyramine, right? Now, if individuals are taking MAO inhibitors, right, then that makes sense why tyramine could accumulate, right? Now, if tyramine accumulates, they bind to these norepinephrine receptors and trigger the release of high levels of norepinephrine, leading to hypertensive crisis, right? If you know anything much about like norepinephrine, you just kind of like associate it as basically being the same sort of thing as epinephrine. So if you remember like what adrenaline kind of does and what your SNS symptoms are kind of associated to your sympathetic nervous system, right? That's basically just what that would do is be activating that system. So you could have like headaches, palpitations, right? Your heart rate going so fast that you feel it. Nausea, vomiting, and also elevated blood pressure, right? That kind of goes along with that vasoconstriction that you would get with adrenaline. All right. But anyway, main thing to know here is that MAO inhibitors, if you're taking that, you could have tyramine accumulate, and also just know what tyramine does as well. So like what the side effects of having too much tyramine would do. So that's a very high yield point. All right, this kind of goes a little bit more into the difference between epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, in regards to like fight or flight, they're very similar. So they both kind of do that sort of thing. But there are differences among this. But I don't remember her asking really anything about this sort of thing, so I didn't put a star or anything on that. But I decided to include it just in case you get confused about the difference between the two, and just to know like what the actual differences between them are. So just more of an FYI. This talks a little bit more about like dopamine. The thing I thought that was important on here was that norepinephrine and dopamine allow for focus and think. I think that may have been maybe something related to a sort of question, so I decided to keep it in here just in case. And that's why I put this thing in red here. So focus, so anytime you think about focusing, right, you want to think about more so norepinephrine, and thinking, more so dopamine. All right. Then on to this next slide here. So it's talking about serotonin biosynthesis from tryptophan. So we haven't really talked about tryptophan or serotonin at all at this point, so this is like brand new stuff, right? So first enzyme that happens here that she doesn't really go much into detail at all about is this tryptophan hydroxylase, okay? So not really super high yield to know much about that one, but she does mention here that BH4 is needed for that, but once again, she didn't bold it or anything, so I don't think she would ask much about that. Second step here is what's more important because she has this bolded, and notice here that it requires PLP, and from what my recollection is, let me make sure I'm correct, but yeah, see this is the exact same enzyme that was mentioned earlier, so make sure not to confuse yourself. It is the same enzyme, but it's in a different case, right? So in this case, you're getting tryptophan to form serotonin, but in the last case, right, you're trying to get dopamine or dopa to form norepinephrine. So that's the difference between the other ones. But anyway, so dopa decarboxylase, as it's already mentioned before, requires PLP. So she mentions it twice, she bolds it twice. That's something you probably need to know, so that's why I put 2 stars beside it. So serotonin, melatonin are formed from tryptophan. So not only is serotonin formed from tryptophan, but also melatonin. Now, what's important about this whole slide here, I feel like, is kind of what serotonin is involved in. So I've kind of mentioned some of it already. It's involved in mood, so it's more responsible for feeling of satisfaction and happiness. And I've already mentioned about like lack of serotonin can result in depression. Now, of course, that's like more of a theory. They haven't exactly proved that, but there is some strong evidence suggesting that. But yeah. Then on to, so like I said before, melatonin is also formed from here. So melatonin, what it actually does here is that it increases in level during the dark, like in the dark, and so melatonin kind of induces that. It has a lot to do with like your circadian rhythm and allowing you to fall asleep at the correct time. So that's what melatonin does. So that's why it says produced in response to light-dark cycle, because when it's dark, right, you want to fall asleep, so therefore your melatonin builds up and allows you to go to sleep easier and faster, right? So I would just know what each of them kind of are responsible for. I think this next slide, okay, no, it doesn't. But anyway, I would just know what melatonin is for and what serotonin is for. I don't think she really asked anything at all about specifics as far as like how they're made, really. Histamine, that's kind of the same case with histamine. I don't remember asking anything about like how it's made, but just kind of what it does. The thing I have underlined here is the point about histamine that you don't typically think about, at least I don't. So that's why I had it underlined, just in case somebody's like me. What you typically think about histamine doing is vasodilation and bronchoconstriction. And the only reason I kind of thought about it that way is because, I mean, I've already had like pharm at this point, so that part kind of like automatically comes to mind, but I always forget about the gastric side of histamine. Of course, that's going to be more your H2 receptors, but regardless, it is still something histamine does. So I'd probably know all of this info. Probably wouldn't hurt, of course, as always, to be familiar with the other info as well, but I would definitely keep what it does in mind. Alright, same sort. I've already kind of mentioned most of this stuff. It kind of gives more details into what H1 more so does. So H1 is the more this little paragraph or this little point here, right? That's this part. While H2 is going to be doing more so this acid secretion. So that's what these blockers affect, those different processes, right? And then GABA. So GABA is produced by decarboxylation of glutamate. So I think I may have mentioned this back either some other test or something before. I know I've seen it somewhere in MFM, I think. But anyway, so I may have already mentioned this sort of thing. But anyway, glutamate is what allows GABA to be produced via that decarboxylation step. PLP, once again, it's mentioned here again, right? And it's in bold. So you should know that it's being used here to make GABA from glutamate via this that enzyme, glutaminase. Well, not glutaminase, but actually doesn't even mention it on this slide. Interesting. But yeah, I would just know that you need PLP in order to get GABA from glutamate. Anyway, and I think that's pretty much it for this one here. Glutathione. We've already talked about glutathione back a while ago with that whole G6PD deficiency. We've kind of talked about glutathione. But so that's actually summed up over here, I think. Yeah, about that whole process. But anyway, the only thing I would really know is that it has protection against free radical injury, which you guys have, like I said, already talked about. So I don't really see her asking much about it, but it was mentioned in her objectives, so I decided to leave it in there. Creatinine, or creatine actually. So I don't know why I keep saying creatinine, probably because of renal. But anyway, so creatine. So it's kind of creatinine. I'm getting confused in my head. Anyway, spontaneous cyclation of creatine phosphate, generates creatinine. So that's where the difference is between those two. And also you can kind of like follow this and figure that out from there. What the difference between creatine and creatinine is basically these two steps here. But anyway, creatinine from creatine can be used to kind of analyze how your kidneys are working. And so that's what I have. There was like a slide that summed that up for you, but I decided to leave it down here in the notes section as this bolded statement. So a rise in serum creatinine is due to an excretion decrease into the urine. So what does that mean? Since you're no longer able to excrete it and you have like high levels of that creatinine, that means there must be some sort of damage to your glomerular units of the kidney. So that's what that means. Then I decided to leave this slide on here as well. I know we've already mentioned it, but just in case she was to mention it, she does like to talk a little bit about NO, or nitric oxide, so I decided to leave it in there. All this stuff she's already mentioned. I wouldn't really worry too much about the different types of NOS. Don't really think she ever asked much about that. But just know like how it's formed, right, from arginine by NOS. That's pretty much the only thing I would use here. Maybe also just kind of that's used in control blood pressure, kind of what the functions of NOS or NO is. This goes a little bit more into detail on how it's formed. That's what I think would be more high yield out of these two slides, is how it's formed in this case, via this whole cyclic GMP type process. But this kind of sums it up pretty well for you. So notice NO comes in from these different places, right? So not only can you get it from a neuron, but you can also get it from these other type cells as well. But anyway, that NO, or nitric oxide, right, can go turn on guanylate cyclase, right, and form cyclic GMP from GTP. And that cyclic GMP is what leads to that relaxation of the smooth muscle and typically dilation of blood vessels. So that's typically where this smooth muscle is associated, is right beside blood vessels. All right, so that's it for that one. So on to the next one. That one was a pretty big chunk of all of this, so hopefully we can get a little bit faster through this stuff. But anyway, so heme, porphyrin, metabolism, iron, homeostasis. I don't know why I had trouble saying that. All right, this picture is very, very useful. She doesn't go as much. I don't think she goes as much into detail as you have to know like later on, as far as like actual heme, right? That we had earlier on this semester as a second year. But I thought this was a very, very good picture as far as kind of knowing where these different parts of this heme forming process take place. So that's why I really, really like this picture. She does also mention in this picture like where ALA synthase is taking place. So I would at least know where all of these are located. That would be something I would keep in mind if I were you guys. Also, she does mention like key enzymes along the way. So any enzyme that she mentions with much detail, I would keep in mind as well. But she doesn't mention all of them. Believe me, because there's quite a few of them. And typically they're named after whatever was before them. So like you'll have like, for instance, you'll have like alpha amyllavinic acid or whatever, ALAS, and so on and so forth, right? Like that's kind of how it goes. But anyway, so on to this next part here. Let me make sure nothing's okay. ALA synthase is the committed step for heme biosynthesis. I include this slide mainly because it mentions once again PLP here. So ALAS requires PLP as coenzyme. So make sure to always know what PLP is used with. So vitamin B6 or PLP is used in this process as well. Anyway, so and just to sum that up for you, where that comes from, right? So ALA synthase is on this picture here. So that's ALAS, right? That's where that comes from. So this is where this is happening. So it's happening within the mitochondrial matrix. Now, there are differences in terms of like ALAS1 or ALAS2, and so I'll underline kind of like the main difference. So it's mainly just where it occurs at. Of course, the one that's more important to you in this case is going to be typically ALAS2. So I'm able to keep that one in mind in terms of it being the more associated with like RBCs or red blood cells. But really, I don't remember asking specifics on different types of ALAS. Now, anytime, like I've already mentioned before, if they mention any kind of specific anemias or disorders or anything, you have to always keep in mind kind of what the differences are between the two, so you can kind of differentiate them. All right. Now, both of these cause what we refer to as microcytic hypochromic anemia. So microcytic is basically just like small red blood cells, so they become like very small. Hyperchromic would be like that they kind of lose their typical shape or color. Right, that's going to be typically what your hypochromics refer to as. Right, makes sense with its name. Right, hypochromic, so loss of color. Microcytic, smaller. But anyway, because of that lack of hemoglobin, so that's why you get microcytic hypochromic. Is any time that you can't form correct hemoglobin, that's where you get microcytic hypochromic. But we'll go a little bit more into detail of that later. Anyway, why I have this here, right, like why I have this in red, is because it's like a main difference between lead poisoning anemia and iron deficiency anemia. So notice with iron deficiency anemia, that leads to an insertion of zinc to yield zinc protoporphyrin, so ZNPP, and that is an important clinical indicator of iron deficiency. So if you were to have this indicator within your blood, right, if you saw ZNPP on the test, says that it's in the blood, right, that would be a way to differentiate it if they gave you microcytic hypochromic as like your main thing, and then they say ZNPP was found in the bloodstream. Well, then it must be an iron deficiency anemia. So that's why I decided to include this slide, put 2 stars with it. All right. Now, lead poisoning, this one goes a little bit more into detail into that. So the thing about lead poisoning, it actually affects like specific enzymes. One of them we've already talked about, Well, actually, no, we haven't talked about that one. That was the next one in the step. My bad. So this one's ALA dehydratase. So that's one of them. So it could affect this enzyme right here in order to form porphobilininogen. It's hard for me to really say that one. And also it can do with ferrochelatase as well. So that's actually the last step. So you add on that iron to protoporphyrin 9 to form heme. Right. So lead poisoning can affect the whole heme pathway either at this point or at this point. So I'd probably keep those enzymes in mind as well. But yeah, so it is a little different in how it does its action because it activates those enzymes. But anyway, so in lead poisoning, the production of heme, right, is already decreased. And also, what you notice here is that you would get accumulation, right, of the things before those enzymes, right? So notice ALA dehydratase, right, is going to be, like I've mentioned already, ALA to porphobilininogen, right? So if that goes down, so that dehydratase no longer is functioning well, then you're going to have accumulation of this ALA, right? And also, if your chelase also goes down, then you'll have accumulation of this protoporphyrin 9. So that's what this is referring to here. Therefore, if they don't function, then you can't form heme, and you'll have that accumulation like I've already mentioned. Increased urinary excretion of ALA is a leading indicator of heavy metal poisoning. So it mentions specifically ALA here. So you know how I mentioned back here with this zinc protoporphyrin for iron deficiency anemia? Remember ALA for heavy metal poisoning or lead poisoning. So that's a way to kind of distinguish them, as well as like if the specific enzyme is being affected. So keep that in mind. Very important stuff. Also, I didn't know if I really honestly don't remember if she asked much about the symptoms of lead toxicity, but I decided to include it just in case. And I put a star with it because I'm like, well, maybe she'll kind of give you a vignette with the symptoms in terms of, like, so say someone comes in and matches some of these symptoms and you want to be kind of leaning toward lead toxicity. But she will give you more than just symptoms. But if it's something that helps you and it's in the vignette, then by all means use it. All right. Porphyrias. Yeah, I think that's how you really say that. I'm not too sure, honestly. So what these are is just the other enzymes are being affected specifically. The ones we'll go into detail here are acute intermittent porphyria and porphyria cutanea tarda. She goes into more detail with these next slides, but I decided to include that just because, I don't know, just in case you want to know more about porphyrias. But mainly, it's just a name for a specific enzyme being affected along the heme pathway. So don't read too much into what porphyria kind of means. All right. Anyway, so I've kind of put in red what I thought and underlined kind of what was the more important things in here from what I remember, especially in red. So acute intermittent porphyria. So that is specifically a deficiency of uroporphyrinogen 1 synthase. So remember that enzyme along with AIP. So acute intermittent porphyria. All right. And now what does that result in? You get an accumulation of ALA and porphobilinogen in blood and CSF. So if you have porphobilinogen and ALA accumulated, then you want to think that. And the reason is because if you think about it, so actually I don't even see that enzyme on here. But regardless, you'd have like accumulation of those. For some reason, I didn't really see it on this lax picture, but it is on I think that one we had in the beginning. Let me look back to it real quick. Well, I think it's like a sidestep off that pathway. But regardless, that's not super important to know. What you need to know, acute intermittent porphyria, deficiency of UPI, uroporphyrinogen 1 synthase, leads to that accumulation of amino, ALA basically, and porphobilinogen. Also, I would kind of keep in mind as well that I don't have highlighted as much as kind of, if it helps you, of course, to know the symptoms associated. So it does mention up here a little bit more about that sort of thing. But from what I remember, I think you can kind of figure out from its accumulation and from it being a deficiency of that enzyme. Also, I thought was important that may have been mentioned either in a TBL or something before. I'm not really sure, but acute attacks of this can be precipitated by barbiturates, phenytoin, these other drugs, because this induction of synthesis of P450. So keep that in mind as well. Um, I also thought this one may be kind of important, but I didn't really know about this hematin thing, but I'm not really going to mention much about it because, like I said, I don't really remember it being all that important. The things are red, super important. These other things, not so sure. Alright, Porphyria cutanea tarda. So, another one that we need to know. Defect of uroporphyrinogen decarboxylase. So, it's a different enzyme. Make sure you know those two together. And also, the thing that's like really like distinguishing about this one is the patient presents with cutaneous photosensitivity. So if they mention anything about avoiding sunlight or that like it really that hurts to be out in the sun, like if you feel like a burning sensation or something like that, this is the disease you need to be thinking of automatically. So that's why I have it bolded and underlined and in red. So super important. And I even mentioned down here, sunlight avoidance, big hint. Okay. So I include this slide because it does give maybe a little bit more info about the different ones. I think I might have looked it over and it kind of helped me kind of make a little bit more sense at the time, but I decided to include it just in case it helps you. Heme degradation and bilirubin excretion. So of course most heme comes from RBCs, and most RBCs are degraded in the liver and the spleen, right? But anyway, the thing that's kind of more important on this slide is this whole process, which we're going to be talking more about. So heme, when it's being degraded, turns into bilirubin, then bilirubin is eventually excreted. But we're going to go more into detail. So I would know every single enzyme and every single thing that's mentioned on this slide. So it's important. So that's why I put like 1 star here. Now, as far as like which ones she asked specifically about, that's why I didn't put like 2 stars on this thing, because I'm not sure if she got a question exactly from this slide, but it is important to know the pathway as far as like how heme is broken down. Okay. So anyway, so the first thing that happens here is that the initial reaction, right? It cleaves that porphyrin ring, catalyzed by this heme oxygenase to form biliverdin. So basically, right, you get heme via the heme oxygenase to form biliverdin. So biliverdin, you're going to think it's like yellow-green color. Okay. Now biliverdin is going to be converted to bilirubin by biliverdin reductase. So that's all summed up in this picture over here for easiness, for you to just read through. And that's going to be more of a red-orange color. Okay. Now almost all cells, they generate bilirubin, right? But only the liver itself can convert bilirubin to more soluble forms of bilirubin, known as these bilirubin conjugates, and that's responsible. Like, how does it do that? Is via this specific enzyme that's found only in the liver, right? That's what I just said. It's found only in the liver, so UDP gluconeoryl transferase. Very important enzyme. That's probably the most important thing on here, along with the different colors for bilirubin and biliverdin. As well as, honestly, this whole process, it wouldn't hurt you to memorize it. Okay, conjugation of bilirubin with this, something you don't really honestly need to know. You don't really need to remember diglucan, however you say it. Increases its water solubility, what I've already mentioned, and allows that conjugated bilirubin to be excreted. So that's the main purpose of why you do that, is so that way it's easily soluble in water and can then be getting rid of. Is that the same thing as bilirubin gluconeoryl transferase? Honestly, I don't. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, I don't know why they call it that, but yeah, we always refer to it as UDP gluconeoryl transferase. But yeah, the picture is a little different as far as its naming, but yeah, it's the same thing. But I would definitely know it as UDP gluconeoryl transferase because that's what she mentions it as. But yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah, no problem. It's a good question. But yeah, like I said, once it's been conjugated in the liver via that enzyme, that's how you'll be able to get rid of it. And that's where you kind of get like problems with it that we'll mention later with neonatal jaundice. Is that enzyme. Anyway, so I put a star here because I wasn't entirely sure if you need to know every single thing on this picture. I would say I doubt it. A lot of what's important here for you is going to be, you don't really have to know much about it being recycled. So anytime it mentions that, you don't really have to worry about that so much. I would probably remember, from this step onward, at least in this picture specifically, is that this conjugated bilirubin, right, which is where we're at currently, is secreted into the bile and then into the intestine. So it goes in the bile first, then into the intestine, right? And then once it's in the intestine, this gluconorenic acid is removed by bacteria. The resulting bilirubin is converted to urobilinogen. So just basically know that from that thing right here, right, that conjugated bilirubin, you get urobilinogen within the intestine via the bacteria helping make that process. Okay, so then you get that urobilinogen, and then in step 7, right, some of that urobilinogen is reabsorbed from the gut. So that's the part I'm talking about. That's not super important. I would say another part of this that is important, however, is this step 10 here. So urobilinogen is oxidized by other bacteria to form the brown stercobilin. So that's what makes your feces turn brown color. So that's why we'll go more into detail about specific disease states that will result in pale colored stool. So that's kind of why I thought it was more important to know that from this picture, more so than recycling. Recycling, you don't really talk about that much with this. We will talk about it a little more in physio, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about it more in detail second year with GI, but we haven't gotten to that. But yeah, that's just info. All right, then hemolytic or prehepatic jaundice. So you do need to know the difference between the different types of jaundice, the clinical signs of them. So we'll go a little bit into, so there's prehepatic jaundice, there's hepatic jaundice, and then there's posthepatic jaundice. So you need to make sure to be able to differentiate between those three, as well as what makes neonatal jaundice occur, which we'll get to after that. First point, that liver can handle however much, and that's more of an FYI statement. Anytime it ever says anything that sounds like that, it's pretty much FYI. Hemolytic anemia causes massive production of bilirubin, right? And that makes sense when you think about it, right? Because your RBCs, right, are going to have the biggest concentration of heme, right? That's where a whole lot of heme is going to be coming from. And if you have anemia, which basically just means that you're going to break apart a whole lot of RBCs, right? They're either going to be non-functional and therefore broken down, or something else that's causing them to be broken down at a faster rate, right? Therefore, you're going to have a whole bunch of heme that you need to get rid of, and therefore you're going to have bilirubin. But the thing to notice here, right, is if you have too much bilirubin, then you could overcome the capacity for the liver to actually turn that into conjugated bilirubin. So basically, you've just made too much bilirubin, and now to the point to where you're not able to make it water soluble. Okay, so what's going to happen there in that case is you're going to have increased bilirubin excreted into the bile, right, which makes sense. Urobilinogen is increased in the blood, all right, and then unconjugated bilirubin in the blood increase. And so that's what causes your jaundice. It's because of that unconjugated bilirubin, right? Because we've already mentioned that it overloads the liver's capacity to form conjugated bilirubin. So that's why you get this ton and ton and ton of unconjugated bilirubin. Therefore, you get that jaundice. But yeah. So then, genetic causes of this hemolytic anemia. So this gives you specific ones, different types of anemias. It may be important to help you with the vignette. So that's why I included it as bolded. Excess hemoglobin binds to, so this is kind of another diagnostic as far as how it could be hemolytic jaundice. That's why I decided to keep this here for you guys. Low plasma levels of haptoglobin. Now haptoglobin, what it'll typically do is it's just kind of another protein that wanders in the blood. But anyway, so if you have too much hemoglobin, right, which would happen in this case because you're not able to basically get rid of it, get rid of heme, and therefore you won't be able to get rid of as much hemoglobin. So therefore, excess hemoglobin binds to haptoglobin, and thus removing haptoglobin from circulation. Therefore, so what it's basically saying is that haptoglobin is measured via it being free and not bound to anything. So kind of how we mentioned about calcium, how it's active state is being free in the blood, same sort of thing. So when you measure haptoglobin, you're measuring free haptoglobin, not haptoglobin that's bound to hemoglobin. So if haptoglobin's low, then that means that you have a whole bunch of hemoglobin binding to it, and therefore you probably have this prehepatic jaundice. But yeah. Then hepatocellular or hepatic jaundice, same thing. Now the difference between these two, right, is that with hemolytic or prehepatic jaundice, it's more of like a blood issue, right? That's causing you to have too much bilirubin formed. But in the case here, is that it's not so much that you have too much bilirubin, but that you cannot actually conjugate bilirubin to form, like to basically continue that whole pathway. Therefore, it does increase unconjugated bilirubin, just like the one we talked about. But if you remember right from this one, it's because you get past the liver's capacity to do that process, that conjugation process. In this case, you can't do the conjugation process. So that's the main difference between those two. Okay. Now, secretion of conjugated bilirubin in the bile is also compromised, so urobilinogen is decreased in the urine. Now, you remember how I mentioned here, stool may be pale or clay color. So that is definitely something to help you differentiate between this one and the other one. And I do remember that being in like the vignette. So if they say anything about the pale or clay color, you want to think about this one. And I think they even have it with this one as well. Yeah. So these two have like pale and like clay color stool because they're not getting basically any bilirubin. Basically any bilirubin breakdown that allows for that stool to form that color, right? Which, if you remember from this right here, that's step 10 here. So urobilinogens oxidize to form stercobilin. So that's the one that actually gives it that feces color. So now on to the last one here. So post-hepatic jaundice, or basically obstructive jaundice. So that's when you have some sort of obstruction in the bile duct itself. So you're totally fine so you're not having too much heme being formed or broken down or anything. You don't have that issue, so you don't have prehepatic. Your liver's working just fine, right? So you don't have hepatocellular or hepatic jaundice. But in this case, you have an obstruction. So everything's working fine. The only problem is that it's just basically getting backed up. Okay? Now, the main difference between all of these, okay, like between this one and the other one, is this point right here, right, with this whole dark color urine due to increased conjugated bilirubin. So this is the only time that you get an increase really in conjugated bilirubin, except for the other one. I mean, you do a little bit there, but for the most part, this is where you get like a ton of it, okay? Because you can already conjugate just fine, right? Because it's not hepatocellular, but it's just it piles up because of that blockage, and therefore you get dark color urine. So if it says that, also notice, right, I've already mentioned, you do also get that pale clay-colored stools, right, because you're not able to get that stercobilin to get that color. So dark color urine for this one. If they don't mention dark color urine and they say pale clay color stool, probably this one here. And if they mention none of that stuff and they mention anything about haptoglobin being low and you having jaundice, of course you're going to have jaundice with all of these, but they just don't mention anything about clay stool or anything about like dark urine. You need to be thinking more about hemolytic jaundice. All right, then on to the reason I spent so much time on that is because it's like very high yield. So, and I didn't even like decide to include 2 stars on it because I'm like, well, I don't want to put 2 stars on every slide. All right, but then on to this next stuff. So neonatal jaundice. Okay, this is also important. Also the treatment. This is like one of the times where I felt like treatment was actually important because I remember them being maybe mentioning it in the stem or something. So I decided to include that here as well in red. But yeah, neonatal jaundice. So what this is actually late onset of expression of that bilirubin gluconeryl transferase. So if you remember, that's that question you were asking me earlier, Amanda, about like what the difference is between UDP gluconeryl transferase and the one I just mentioned. That's the same enzyme. So UDP gluconeryl transferase and bilirubin gluconeryl transferase is the same thing. But that is what results in neonatal jaundice, is that late onset of expression of that enzyme, otherwise known as UDP gluconeryl transferase or bilirubin gluconeryl transferase. But yeah, and the reason that you have that jaundice happen is because not only are you having that late expression, but you also have this breakdown of that fetal hemoglobin as it's replaced by adult hemoglobin. Because if you guys remember right, adult hemoglobin and fetal hemoglobin, that's two different types of hemoglobin. So this is more like HbF, right? While your adult, it's going to be HbA, right? So in order to get rid of all the HbF, you got to break it down. And if you have that late expression of this enzyme here, then it's just going to have a large buildup of that unconjugated bilirubin and therefore lead to jaundice, right? So that's where that comes from. Now you can kind of treat this with blue fluorescent light because it converts bilirubin to a more polar compound that allows it to be excreted in the body without conjugation. But yeah, I'm pretty sure this was mentioned somewhere within the exam, or she said it was important or something. So that's why I decided to include this in red as well. Now on to something else that's going to be included. So once again, if it mentions it at all about some kind of syndrome or disorder or anything, always know what's being affected. So in this case, UDP gluconeryl transferase, very important enzyme if you haven't noticed, right? Mentioned it like 2 or 3 different times. Now, I did underline phenobarbital, but that's not super important. The thing you need to know here is that you have UDP gluconeryl transferase is not working correctly with Gilbert syndrome. And that's basically all you need to know for that. So what I thought was important here is it talks about how iron's kind of stored. So I'll go a little bit into it. So basically iron is going to be absorbed via, so this is like dietary intake of iron, right? So once you've taken in that iron, it's going to be absorbed via its ferrous state, but then it's oxidized by ferroxidase to be transported. So that's why you need that enzyme in order to make it from ferrous to ferric iron for transport. Okay, so ferroxidase is very important for its transport to get to where it needs to go. So transferrin, so apotransferrin binds to this Fe3+ to form transferrin, which is like your main transport protein. So transferrin, it says it right there. Right. The cell then takes up transferrin through its receptors for transferrin, so transferrin receptors. And then once it's in there, that iron gets stored as ferritin within the cells. And then if you have excess iron, then hemosiderin is going to be that storage. So I would know the different storages, know how it's transported. That's pretty high yield. I left this one in here because I don't remember them asking if they asked anything about it, but I remember it being something I spent a lot of time on, but I don't remember it being important to the exam. But regardless, I'm pretty sure I didn't bold this. I'm pretty sure she bolded it. So maybe look this over, but I wouldn't spend tons and tons of time on it. Alright, now this was important. I do remember this being important, maybe for the TBO, maybe for the exam in general. I can't really remember which one. But I have underlined like the more important things I felt out of this. So serum iron, right, that actually measures the amount of iron within your blood. Okay, so that's what serum iron is. Serum ferritin is going to be how much is actually stored, right? So that's what you're going to be measuring with ferritin, right? But the thing that's more important here is not that it tells you how much is stored, but it tells you, it helps you find out from that, right, how much of your body's stored iron has been used. So not exactly what you would expect, you'd be like, okay, well I know how much iron storage I have. But it's more so to know from that this. So how much has been used. So basically if you're iron deficient or not. Alright, transferritin level or TIBC. Okay. So if you have iron deficiency anemia, you'll have high level of transferrin that has no iron. And the reason that is, right, is because your body's like prepared to take in iron. But you're not taking in any iron, you're very deficient in it. And so therefore, if any kind of iron is in your blood at all, transferrin's there to take it up. So that's why you'll have that high level of transferrin in hopes that you have intake of iron. So that's why it would be higher with iron deficiency anemia. Now you do have transferrin saturation, but she didn't really mention much about it. But I would definitely know these different measurements and what they're kind of used for and what they mean. So yeah. All right, now this one, notice there's 3 stars on this thing. Super important. Okay. And I've already mentioned some of these, right? So microcytic hyperchromic, and that's with thalassemia. So that's like your beta thalassemia, your alpha thalassemia, which you guys haven't really talked too much about, at least on this exam. But the things to be remembering for those are these here. So lead poisoning, vitamin B6, which we mentioned a whole lot, right? Or iron deficiency. So if you have any of those, that's microcytic hyperchromic. Okay. Now, what they would more than likely do on the exam is they would describe RBCs as being microcytic hyperchromic or microcytic normochromic, whatever, right? And so from there on, it'd be more like a second order type thing, right? So you know that, therefore you know it must be either lead poisoning, vitamin B6, or iron deficiency. So it couldn't be any of these other things. Another very common one they like to ask about on this exam is more so vitamin B12 or folic. So we've mentioned a lot about it before. We'll mention a little bit more about folic acid later on in this. But yeah, so I would just definitely know this chart. Normocytic, normochromic, we're probably not going to talk much at all about on the exam, but definitely microcytic hyperchromic and macrocytic normochromic. Very high yield. All right, HH or hereditary hemochromatosis, so HH, right? Now, know the symptoms or signs, right? So cirrhosis, diabetes, cardiac failure, bronzing of skin, especially bronzing of skin. That one's like a dead giveaway, pretty much. Mutation, know the mutation, HFE gene. What does HFE do? Make sure you know that as well. So HFE, what does it do? Binds to the transferrin receptor and reduces the affinity of the receptor for transferrin. So if you have that messed up, then what's going to happen is you're going to have way more absorption of iron, right? Because your transferrin is responsible for its transportation. And so therefore, if you have some sort of enzyme or gene, right, HFE, which prevents too much transferrin being absorbed, then what's going to happen if it's mutated means you're going to have way too much transferrin absorbed, and therefore you're going to end up having these deposits. Now, if you remember, right, ferritin's like your main store for iron, but hemosiderin is if you have way too much iron or excess iron. So that's why you have hemosiderin deposits found in the liver, pancreas, skin, and joints. So if they say anything about hemosiderin deposits or anything like that, or any kind of HFE gene mutated, make sure you know honestly everything on this slide is high yield, except for honestly probably this part up here. But yeah, so know all of this for sure. All right, purine, pyrimidine metabolism. What exactly is causing the cells to be macrocytic with the impaired DNA synthesis? Macrocytic. Macrocytic. You know, I knew this. I knew the answer to this question a couple months ago, but you don't really have to be too much into that right now. That's going to be more like when you take heme. Heme, you definitely would have to know the answer to that question. Honestly, I wish I could tell you. Yeah. I wish I remembered so I could tell you, but it's all kind of died off at this point, unfortunately. But yeah, no, it's nothing you'd have to know for this exam. So sorry about that. I wish I could help. Hey, do you remember why macrocytic, like why if you have like vitamin B12 deficiency, why that's macrocytic? Do you remember that? Like I know it's impaired DNA synthesis, but why? Do you know? Ah, okay. We have someone else working on it. I know it's more like FYI, but I'm kind of interested to remember. Build up of the precursors. Okay. Well, we'll come back to it. So we'll just go ahead and keep going on it, see if she comes up with it. But yeah. So let's continue. So purine and pyrimidine, metabolism. So anyway, what's it's important to know the different pathways for these. So de novo purine synthesis. So the main thing here for this slide, of course, is PRPP, or PRP synthetase. Honestly, it's probably more important than the actual product here. But anyway, very start for purine synthesis. So make sure you know that this is purine synthesis and that's de novo purine, because there is like salvage pathways and other kinds of pathways that you can get purine. Okay. But anyway, so de novo purine synthesis. First step, ribose 5-phosphate to form PRP via this PRP synthetase. All right. So next part, so it's a little bit further on in this, so I think there's like some steps that they don't really go into. So notice like how many other steps are in this process. You don't really have to know these other steps. It's more so important to know this first step here and also these steps that we're just about to go into. So IMP, right? So you reach this fork basically after a few more steps. So IMP, starting point for AMP and GMP. Okay. So in order to form AMP, you need aspartate and GTP. Now in order to form GMP, it's ATP and glutamine. Okay. So make sure you know that. Okay. So in order to get AMP from IMP, aspartate, GTP. In order to get GMP from IMP, ATP, glutamine. Okay. That's why I have this star there. Now, PRP synthetase we've already talked about in terms of how to get PRP, right? Now, I thought it may be important to know that it's inhibited, like what it's inhibited by what and what's synthesized by what. So I thought this slide sums it up really well for you. Now, it makes sense why ADP and GDP would inhibit that, right? Because that means you already have basically the building blocks in order to form ATP and GTP. So you don't really need purine to be formed anymore at that point because you already have the A, right? Or the G. So you don't really need that to be formed, right, if you already have those building blocks. So that's why PRP synthetase would be inhibited. Now, glutamine PRPP, aminotransferase, so that is another enzyme that we mentioned here, but the only reason it's mentioned is not so much for its product, but that's another way for this process to be under the effect of negative feedback. So if you notice, right, this is actually inhibited by all of the end products, not just ADP, GDP, but I doubt you would be all that picky for that, honestly. Just basically know that these are like 2 points within the pathway to where there's can be regulation occurring. All right. Also, another things to keep in mind here. So AMP inhibits adenylosuccinate synthetase. So that's specific for AMP to be formed, while GMP inhibits IMP dehydrogenase. So that one's specific for GMP to be formed. I would definitely know these two. These two are super important. Okay. These other ones, like I said, it's more so just to know that regulation can occur up here, and it's more so these end products that are doing it. But these two are specific to the enzymes responsible for their pathways. Okay. Now, synthesis of AMP requires GDP, and synthesis of GMP requires ATP. Now, if you remember, we just said that on this last slide, so it's already summed up for you. Now, how does the cell make dGDP and dADP? Okay. Now, if you remember, that's like basically the last step before you get dATP, dGTP in order to form DNA, right? The building blocks of DNA. Okay. Which one do you need in order to form that dGDP and GADP? Is this RR, so ribonucleotide reductase. Very important enzyme. Make sure you know that enzyme and where it takes place in this pathway. All right. Humans catabolize purines to uric acid. So this is kind of like, so instead of like talking about how you make DNA, now you're talking more about what do you do once you need to break down these molecules, right? So once you, so how do you get rid of your purines, which you've already made, right? So humans convert adenosine and guanosine to uric acid. So that's like pretty much the end product until it goes into the urine, which we've already kind of actually mentioned uric acid with Dr. Kick's slides a little bit. So it kind of gives you like a good overlay from where that comes from, right? So adenosine first converted to inosine by adenosine deaminase. Okay, so that's right here, right? That'd be this enzyme right here. It doesn't have it named, but that's where it would be taking place. She actually put the color on this one, so I would keep that enzyme in mind. That's why I put the star up here specifically beside that. Um, like I said before, end product, uric acid. They do talk a little bit more about xanthine oxidase, especially in farm. So you'll talk a lot more about allopurinol and xanthine oxidase, a lot more in that class. So that's just a heads up for later. But anyway, if you have too much uric acid, so if too much of this is being broken down, then you can lead to the formation of gout. So that's what gout is, basically like crystallization via having too much uric acid built up. All right, that's what this slide talks all about. Okay. Now specifically, instead of uric acid, it's more so sodium urate. So not really uric acid specifically, but sodium urate if you want to be picky and know exactly what's being accumulated. Okay, but another thing that can result in gout, well, that would definitely result in gout, is if you had a PRP synthase gain of function, right? So if you remember PRP synthase, we've already mentioned back here with this enzyme, right? So that's like more so allowing more nucleotides and purines to be formed, right? So it's not a breakdown enzyme, it's a form enzyme. So that makes more sense as to why it would be a gain of function causing gout more so than a loss of function, right? But anyway, talks a little bit more about like gouty arthritis, but if it mentions anything about like any kind of sodium urate crystals, yeah, I'd probably just know this like picture, know like the different crystals, kind of what they look like, because I think they gave us like a picture of what they like just crystals, and ask like what kind of mutations associated with it, what the crystals are made of, like what that means. But yeah, so definitely keep that in mind. Notice it even mentions allopurinol down here, so maybe she'll ask about it, but I don't remember her asking specifically about it. But once again, it's a very important slide, so just keep this in mind. Hypoxanthine and xanthine is more soluble than uric acid, therefore it's easier to excrete in urine. The reason I have that mentioned here is because if you have allopurinol, right, that actually inhibits xanthine oxidase. So that's that enzyme needed to form uric acid. So that's like the last step. But these things before that last step, so hypoxanthine and xanthine itself, are actually more soluble than uric acid. So therefore, you want to form that more if you have gout. So that way you're able to get rid of it. All right. Purine salvage pathway. Okay, so this is a totally different place, right? So so we've already talked about how you get purines de novo. So that's like nothing out, like you didn't have any purines before. Like how do you form it then from ribose 5-phosphate, right? And we've already talked about how you break it down. So how do you get salvage? So how do you recycle it, basically, right? So when free purines release, yada yada yada, they can be salvaged by reattachment of the bases to PRPP. Okay, so how do you do that? Like how do you take that and use that? You do HGPRT. So that is the main enzyme in order for this to occur. Okay, now you do also have salvage of adenine by APRT. Doesn't really mention as much about that, but HGPRT is very huge. Okay, that is very high yield. That's why I put it 2 stars on there, and that's responsible for purine salvage pathway. Okay, now also Leishnayan, know it. Okay, anytime this thing's mentioned, it's pretty much always a need to know basis. So Leishnayan, always. Okay, HGPRT deficiency. So what would that mean, right? What that means is that you're not able to basically salvage your purines, right? Because that's the main enzyme responsible. So what that's going to cause is you're going to have PRP levels increased, purine synthesis in excess, therefore increased degradation of purines, resulting in, right, what you would think if you can no longer degrade purines. Well, actually, if you're increasing degradation of purines because you're not able to salvage them, right, you're not able to reuse them, therefore you have high plasma and urine uric acid, right, because that's that last thing that we just talked about with gout. Okay. Now, instead of basically just getting gout, with Leishnayan, you get intellectual disability and self-mutilation. Okay, self-mutilation is a huge hint. Okay, if you hear that, on that exam, which I'm pretty sure they mentioned it when they mentioned that. If they say anything about somebody hurting themselves and about having like high levels of uric acid or something like that, that dead pan, that's it. Is last night. Okay. Legit. Oh. Anyway, so ADA deficiency. Um, so let's talk a little bit more about another pathway. Sorry for the stars blocking the picture there. I thought it kind of like you don't really need to know the little ADP here. So I was like, it's no big deal if it covers it. Anyway, so adenosine first converted to inosine. So we've already kind of talked about this already, right? It's via this enzyme right here, and adenosine deaminase. Okay. Now, if ADA is deficient, then adenosine obviously accumulates, right? Because that would be the beginning product, and inosine is the end product. Okay. Now, adenosine, right? If it accumulates, right, can be phosphorylated directly back to AMP by adenosine kinase. So it can kind of go like the opposite direction, right? Because this would be like your breakdown pathway. So it's able to go backwards in this pathway. So you remember how I say ADA is for this like IMP to inosine thing here? It's able to go backwards. So it's able to go from that IMP to AMP via this adenosine kinase. That's if you have a deficiency. Okay. Now, ADA deficiency can cause, and more than likely would cause, severe combined immunodeficiency disease, so SCID. Okay. Patients with ADA deficiency will have an increased concentration of DATP, right? And the reason that you would have that is because you're able to basically reform that, right? So you know how I mentioned last time that you can phosphorylate directly back to AMP, okay? If you can go back to AMP, you can therefore form ATP or DATP, right? But anyway, so that's why with an ADA deficiency, since you're able to go backwards, that's why you form a whole lot of DATP and you don't break that down, right? Now, the thing that's important about DATP, another thing about it, is that it's an inhibitor of ribonucleotide reductase. Now, if you remember ribonucleotide reductase, or RR, it actually forms DGDP and DADP from ADP and GDP. Okay, so very, very important in terms of like forming DNA, right? So if that inhibition happens, you won't be able to form DNA synthesis, like you won't be able to form any DNA at all, right? And therefore, you won't be able to divide cells, essentially. But what I haven't mentioned yet, okay, is that immune cells are the ones that are typically affected by this, okay? And the reason is because immune cells have a very short-term life, and they have to divide very, very fast. So that makes sense if you have an inhibition of DNA synthesis, you won't be able to do either one of those. You won't be able to basically make more cells very quickly, and you won't be able to divide very fast, right? Because both of those are very, very important in meiosis, okay? So that's why you get SCID or severe combined immunodeficiency because of that. So this slide does a very, very good job of explaining that. Very high yield, so that's why I put the star there. All right. Now on to, instead of purines, now we're on to pyrimidine. So other parts of DNA, right? So pyrimidine synthesis. So this goes a little bit more into details about that. The things that she has in bold here, probably what's more needed to know. You've actually already talked a little bit about pyrimidine synthesis, if you think about it, right? With this cell CPS2. So we've already mentioned pretty much all of this anyway. The only part that we didn't really mention much about is that uric acid. You remember that, right? That's how that's like on Dr. Kick slides. And he even mentions like UMP on there as well. But UMP synthase is what converts uric acid to UMP. So just make sure you know that. Now, I included the slide, but I don't remember there being really anything asked much about it. But it's just to kind of give you, well, what regulation happens with pyrimidine synthesis instead of purine synthesis? Because we already mentioned that, right? Well, CPS2 is like the main regulation point for that process. So PRPP, that's already like part of this process. So if you notice right here, right, it's kind of like a cofactor for that whole process to occur. it makes sense for that to activate CPS2 in order to continue the whole process, right? Now with CPS2 inhibition, UDP and UTP makes sense why you wouldn't want to form more UMP if you already have like basically the more advanced version of UMP. So it's kind of back when we already mentioned it with purine synthesis. All right. Now the methylation of uracil, okay, is catalyzed by thymidylate synthase, okay, to form DTMP from DUMP. So this is a very, very important enzyme because this is the only way you can form thymine. Okay, that's the only way you can form DTMP. Which, now if you remember, like from the other ones, right? DATP, DADP or D, all those, right? ADP, GDP, they have their own separate pathway. But TMP is relied upon UMP. So that's what makes it a little different. And the way it breaks itself apart, the fork in that road is thymidylate synthase. Okay. So keep that in mind. Very, very important enzyme. Okay. DUMP is converted to DTMP by receiving a methyl group from methylene FH4. I would also keep methylene FH4 in your mind as well. She does like to talk a little bit about these different FH molecules. Let's see here. Let's see, I normally like. Oh. Okay. Anyway, so this is also important as well. So that's super high here. So 5-fluorouracil. You need to know what it inhibits and what does it mean. Okay. So I just mentioned how thymidylate synthase is important in order to form DTMP from DUMP. And right, if you block that off, like I said, that's the only way you can form thiamine, right? That results in thiamineless death, okay? Now, it's used in cancer chemotherapy, right, because cancer cells, like immune cells, like we already kind of mentioned with ADA deficiency, they also need all these building blocks, right? They need your ATP, they need the adenine, guanosine, thymine, cytosine, right? They need all of them, okay? So if thiamine can't be formed, then you basically can't form DNA, and therefore, cells that basically, like I've already mentioned, they replicate a whole bunch, need that, they're not able to do that. So therefore, used in cancer chemotherapy quite often because of that reason. So 5-fluorouracil, know what it inhibits, know that leads to thiamineless death. You don't really have to know that it's used in cancer chemotherapy, you'll know that with farm. Alright, catabolism of pyrimidines. Okay, so how are they broken down? So in contrast to purines, pyrimidine rings can be cleaved and degraded to highly soluble end products. So it's really not a big deal at all. So she doesn't really want you to know much at all about catabolism of pyrimidines. It's more so purines with that whole gout problem, right? And all that other disease process we've already talked about. All right, salvage of pyrimidines. Now you can also get salvage of that as well, but it's via these nucleoside kinases. So different enzyme, but it also can occur. So instead of HGPRT, you have nucleotide kinases. This talks a little bit more about orotic aciduria. I thought it might help you with Dr. Kick's type stuff, so I kept it in there. Don't really remember not exactly sure. I think this tells you the difference between if OTC is deficient and UMP synthase is deficient. I don't remember her really asking much about these in terms of this different stuff. This would probably be more of a Kick type question because he's going to be asking way more about OTC. But I decided to include it, put a star just in case. But if you have any questions about it, let me know. All right, now on to vitamins and 1-carbon metabolism and all this other jazz, right? Would you have anemia in any of these cases? Anemia. I guess, well, when we talk about anemia, at least in this exam, you're talking more about a deficiency in either iron, or you're talking about a vitamin deficiency. That's where you're going to be talking a little bit more about different types of anemia. But I would say, at least with this, you probably wouldn't have. Let me see, UMP synthase. I know I mentioned that somewhere. Sorry, I get kind of lost sometimes. I guess it's possible, yeah, you would have anemia. But typically, what we're going to be thinking about with, I mean, if you think about it, right, with that 88 deficiency, you're going to be thinking about stuff that replicates more often, right? So you're going to be thinking more along the lines of like those immune cells. So you could have an immune problem, definitely from these cases. So if like UMP synthase didn't work correctly, right? You could definitely have that. But yeah, I would say anemia could also be a result as well. But yeah, as far as like knowing that for the exam though, um, yeah, I would just have to know. I would know that chart that I mentioned back a while ago about like microcytic, normochromic, and all that jazz. Yeah, I keep that in mind. All right. Then on to, oh, and of course all those like heme um, problems. So porphyrins. Yeah. All right. Functions of one carb metabolism. So what this basically is all about, it tells you about the importance of like FH4 and like basically like methyl groups being transferred and stuff. So it is important. It's kind of complicated sometimes, but I'll try to do my best with it. Okay, so I had biotin and all that stuff underlined, but I don't think it was all that important to really know in the case of this specific lecture. All right. So tetrahydrofolate, so FH4, is the carrier of one carbon group. So it's like your main carrier. So you're going to see methyl FH4, methylene FH4, and formal FH4. So you'll see all of those different ones within these different processes that we're going to be talking about. Vitamin B12, we've kind of already mentioned it with its and Dr. Kick's lecture with the whole homocysteinuria type thing. So we already kind of mentioned that back in the last session I had. But anyway, vitamin B12 transfers a methyl group from methyl FH4 to homocysteine to form methionine, which is used to synthesize SAM. So that's a very important point, and honestly sums it up the best way possible. So I would keep that specific point in mind because it would help you not be as confused. SAM, in other instance, like what is that? It's the main donor of methyl groups, so CH3 groups, right? Folate in its active T8, folate in its active FH4 form. Okay, so we already kind of mentioned a little bit about tetrahydrofolate. But anyway, DHFR converts folate to FH2 and then FH4. So very important enzyme. Put that in red for you there. Also, how this kind of like tells you how you get FH4, right? So kind of tells you how it forms it, basically. And I kind of already mentioned this, right? FH4 can carry one carbon units, either as methyl, methylene, or 4-male. Okay. Now, importance of FH4 in biosynthesis reactions. We kind of already talked about definitely a few of these. We've definitely talked about that one. We had literally just talked about it a minute ago. And I've mentioned it a couple of other times with the synthesis of purine rings, synthesis of DTMP from DUMP. That's like one of the coenzymes or cofactors for that process. So I would probably keep this slide in mind just for like what processes it occurs in, just to kind of keep your head straight. All right. Then on to this slide here. So the reason I thought this was very important is just it tells you what methotrexate does. So methotrexate competitively inhibits DHFR. So what is DHFR? We've already kind of mentioned it, right? Dihydrofolate reductase. And what does that do? It allows not only FH2 to form FH4, but folate to form FH2. Okay, so very important enzyme. Enzyme in order to form FH4 or tetrahydrofolate, but methotrexate blocks that enzyme. Okay, now, that makes sense, right? If you block off methotrexate, that's going to basically block off that whole DUMP to DTMP process, but in a different fashion, right? So if you remember, like how I mentioned earlier in this slide, with this, that you need this tetrahydrofolate in order to form DTMP from DUMP. This slide shows you exactly how. Okay, because you have that D8 that. So notice you use it up right here, right? You have that FH4 being used in order to use it in order to form that DTMP, but it has to be recycled. Okay. Now, in order for FH2 to form FH4, we already just covered that, right? You need DHF4. Now, if you have methotrexate, that stops that whole process. Therefore, you won't be able to recycle it and form FH4 again. Therefore, you won't be able to form DTMP. So that's why they both result in thiamineless death, but in two different ways, right? Because 5-fluorouracil doesn't mess around, stops thiaminoylate synthase right in its tracks. But dihydrofolate reductase, that's methotrexate. So no methotrexate and 5-fluorouracil in one enzymes they mess with. Like what that means. So basically that you can't form DTMP from DUMP. Okay. And methotrexate, of course, that you can't form FH4 to recycle to form DTMP. And that they both, since you don't form DTMP anymore, that's a thiamineless death. That is a very key phrase that she likes to use. So keep that in mind. All right, function of vitamin B12. We've already talked a little bit about it. The things I haven't read down here is just to kind of remind you that you need vitamin B12 in order for that whole regeneration of FH4 instances of SAM. So you've already talked about that in Dr. Kick's lectures back a while ago, but this is just kind of a reminder for you. But if you do have a deficiency of methionine synthase or deficiency of vitamin B12, you can have hyperhomocysteinemia, or according to Dr. Kick's lectures, you would have homocysteinuria. Okay, so basically same sort of thing, but you can also have too much homocysteine in the blood as well because of it. Right. B12 is required for SAM biosynthesis and regeneration of FH4, exactly what I just had read just a second ago. And this kind of breaks down, tells you how it's specific. So I decided to include a little star with that. But the thing that's super important here is just the main basic principle alongside it. All right. SAM is also required for inactivation of catecholamines and serotonin. Wasn't entirely sure if that was super important to know, but since it kind of tells you what SAM, like what other stuff it does, I figured it might be important to know, and so I put it in red for you guys, but I didn't put a star. All right. Now, what is important is how you get vitamin B12. That was important to know. Okay. So make sure you know this whole process here. So basically, what happens is you have B12 binds R binder proteins, right, which are secreted by salivary glands and gastric mucosa. So that's like the very first thing that you get that B12 binds to, right? Now, in the small intestine, R binders are digested and released B12 binds to intrinsic factor, which is also secreted by gastric mucosa. So, very first thing, R binders, right? B12 binds to it, goes to the intestine, breaks down that R binder. That's where you get that intrinsic factor binds to it. Then intrinsic factor B12 combo, right? Then goes to its specific receptor. So notice it's like this little green molecule here, and that whole complex is internalized. Then transcobalamin 2 B12 complex then delivers B12 to the tissues. So I would know this whole process, especially R binders and intrinsic factor, especially intrinsic factor. So that's kind of like the order of importance. Pernicious anemia, very, very important to know. Honestly, I probably could have put in red more of this slide, but I decided, it's all kind of important, kind of helps you a little bit. Especially in terms, so these are like all the different ways that you could get pernicious anemia. So what is that exactly? So it's just basically severe megaloblastic anemia caused by malabsorption of dietary cobalamin or B12. Okay, so basically you're not getting enough B12 within your body. Okay, now how would you have that? Obviously, not having enough in it of your diet, right? So B12 diet deficiency. Could also have what we normally refer to it a lot as intrinsic factor being deficient, because that's what's really required for absorption. Also, if you had, of course, absent or diseased gastric mucosa, you're not able to absorb it anyway. If you had pancreatic insufficiency, then you wouldn't have. It would kind of cause for those R binders not to be broken down, essentially. So therefore, you wouldn't have intrinsic factor to be formed onto it. And of course, you could have problems with transcobalamin. B12 deficiency. I would know what B12 deficiency looks like. Make sure that you also get megaloblastic anemia. Make sure you know that it's pernicious anemia. Also, like I just said a second ago, know all these symptoms. They would definitely help you differentiate between the different deficiencies. All right, folate trap synthesis. Notice that there's 3 stars for this thing. Okay, the reason that it's just something they like to ask about. I decided to keep it on here because it's important. Okay, now if carbons cannot be removed from folate, so and the reason that this would happen is because you either have a B12 deficiency, right? If you remember, I kind of already mentioned that you need that B12 in order for that whole recycling part to happen. And we mentioned it quite a bit back with Dr. Kick's lecture, where he mentions this whole process with SAM and homocysteine and methionine. It looks honestly just like this on his PowerPoint. Like it looks just like this. But anyway, if you have a vitamin B12 deficiency or you have methionine synthase deficiency, so that'd be this enzyme right here causing homocysteine to become methionine, or your B12 is low, then of course this doesn't happen. So you won't be able to get rid of that methyl group onto vitamin B12, right? Because we've already mentioned this back a while ago as well, that vitamin B12 is able to accept that methyl group from FH4 or tetrahydrofolate, right? So if neither one of those enzymes so if either methionine synthase is deficient, so not able to recycle the B12, or the B12 is deficient and therefore not able to accept that CH3, then you can have a trapped methyl FH4 form. So folate trap hypothesis, very important. Okay, functional folate deficiency occurs. Methyl trap hypothesis, exactly what I just talked about. Now, what exactly does that cause? Is all these things, right? Hyper homocystinemia, right? Because you just end up with a whole bunch of homocysteine, right? DNA synthesis deficiency, because you're not able to use tetrahydrofolate in order to form that whole DTMP thing that we already talked about. You also get neural tube defects as well as megaloblastic anemia, right? Which we've already kind of talked about with the whole B12 problem. So yeah. And I think this kind of goes like more into specifics on how you get those different things, but it's more so important to just know that you get them. So this is kind of more of like an FYI type slide. All right, so vitamins and minerals. Onward to the next stuff. So yeah, of course, this as it's implied, all of this PowerPoint is just all about vitamins and all about minerals. So I try to highlight the ones that are more important. Took out a few of them that I thought you didn't ask at all about. So I'll let you with the bare essentials, essentially. Things to know about thiamine deficiency. Is definitely very, and also Wernicke-Korsakoff, and that it happens very often. So you can have thiamine deficiency very often with alcoholics. It's going to be your typical person that has a thiamine deficiency. But very. So what is very? Well, you get that from severe thiamine deficiency. Okay, so very characterized by dry skin, irritability, disordered thinking, forgetfulness, and paralysis. I just remember the red statement that very is associated with thiamine deficiency, and yeah. All right, thiamine and alcohol, like I just said, thiamine deficiency most common in alcoholics. Okay, now combination of thiamine deficiency and alcoholic toxicity, so alcohol toxicity, causes Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. So what is Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome? Well, you have mental derangements, loss of memory, delirium, okay, which includes all these separate little symptoms here, ataxia, and paralyses of eye muscles. Typically, you want to just honestly think about somebody that's like the way they always tell us is just think about what a typical drunk person seems like, right? So somebody that like honestly is not in the right mind, right? So mental derangements and delirium, right? Somebody that can't remember very well, right? Can't remember last night, right? If you got too far gone, obviously. So loss of memory, ataxia, can't walk correctly, and paralysis of eye muscles. That's kind of like something to throw in there. But that's the way I kind of tend to remember it. Is think of somebody that you've seen drunk, right? Um, Treatment with thiamine injections, because of course that's going to be your main issue, is that thiamine deficiency. so beriberi, and thiamine deficiency. I mean, not thiamine deficiency, beriberi, thiamine deficiency, Wernicke-Korsakoff, thiamine deficiency, and alcohol toxicity. Riboflavin, okay, that is a precursor for FAD and FMN. So you remember FAD from a long time ago when you were talking about um, that chain, yeah, electron transport chain. So FAD, so that's where that comes from. It's riboflavin. I think that's honestly pretty much the only important thing on there. Niacin, so precursor for NAD, NADP, so no longer FAD or FMN, but NAD, NADP. That's niacin. Niacin deficiency is known as pellagra. I think there may have been a question referred to with pellagra, so I would keep that one in mind. And it does tell you the different signs that you get as well if you had niacin deficiency. So I would definitely keep in mind what pellagra is. So it's rough skin due to deficiency of niacin, but also know that these are associated with niacin deficiency as well, because that'll help you kind of differentiate them. Pyridoxine or vitamin B6. We've talked so much about vitamin B6 or PLP, right? So you already know quite a bit about what it does. So make sure you just kind of review all of that as you go along. Also, so we've talked about how it causes microcytic hypochromic anemia before, but it has its specific name. So sideroblastic anemia is the name associated with vitamin B6 deficiency anemia. And since iron deficiency anemia also causes microcytic hypochromic anemia, the way to differentiate that is that your iron levels are normal in serum with sideroblastic anemia, because that's not an iron deficiency, right? It's a vitamin B6 deficiency. Biotin or B7. I would know the symptoms of a B7 deficiency, so I would know dermatitis, alopecia, bursitis, loss of appetite, nausea. Okay, I would know that. I would also know that this whole biotinidase thing as well, but I don't think it was very high yield. I would just know the symptoms. But yeah. Vitamin B12 requires intrinsic factor. We've already talked about the intrinsic factor part for sure. And we've honestly already talked about this part as well. So honestly, it's a nice little review lecture as well. Kind of helps you review stuff. Deficiency of vitamin C. What does that cause? Scurvy. I'm sure you guys probably have heard quite a bit about how pirates used to get scurvy because they hadn't had vitamin C in such a long time being out on the seas and stuff. So that's why they were prevalent to having scurvy. So you'd have dry mouth, eyes, decaying gums, loose teeth. Mainly it's just like dental problems, the way I typically think about it with scurvy. So no scurvy is vitamin C deficiency. Know what vitamin C deficiency looks like. That's pretty much what you need to know from this slide. 11th cis form of retinol. I would know that specific form of retinol is essential for vision. So basically what's underlined. It's also, and why is that essential for vision, is because it's a major component of visual pigment of rhodopsin and rod cells. So I would know honestly what I've kind of highlighted on this slide. Not really, all this other stuff's more like FYI. Don't really have to know that until physio. Deficiency of vitamin A. So deficiency of retinal, right, which is where 11 cis comes from, right? If you don't have retinal, then you'll have night blindness. Okay, so if you have prolonged deficiency, that'll lead to irreversible loss of visual cells, therefore blindness. Okay, overall. So that's something about vitamin A deficiency. Also, if you have deficiency of retinoic acid, which comes from vitamin A, so both of these actually are, so vitamin A is basically a precursor for retinol and retinoic acid. So that's why you have like two different deficiencies listed here. But kind of goes a little bit more into detail here. The thing I would know is this whole squamous metaplegia thing down here. That's something that seems kind of important. Probably know the what xerophthalmia is. I think that eye stuff's a little bit more important with vitamin A deficiency than anything else. Teratogenic effects of retinoic acid. So know also that either a deficiency or an excess of vitamin A can be teratogenic or cancerous, basically, um, and so therefore can result in congenital malformations to developing fetus and pregnant women. So vitamin E is an antioxidant. So alpha tocopherol, most potent vitamin E. I have that bolded just in case they were to refer it as alpha tocopherol. Basically, know its main job: antioxidant and scavenger of free radicals. I think that's honestly all you need to know right there. Vitamin K. I'm sure you guys may have heard a little bit about vitamin K before. But anyway, vitamin K is coenzyme of glutamine carboxylase. Very, very important in terms of forming coagulation factors, so very, very important for forming clots. Um, so carboxylation of glutamate residues create calcium binding site in these blood clotting factors, so very, very important for clotting, like I just mentioned. Um, Vitamin K deficiency is most common in newborns, also associated with long-term broad-spectrum antibiotic therapy. Um, reason that is because you get some of your vitamin K from bacteria within yourself, so that's where you get some forms of vitamin K, but you still need to take in some from your diet as well. But yeah, vitamin K antagonists, so warfarin and dicumarol. So basically, warfarin is the one you're typically going to hear most about. Um, what that does is it antagonizes the gamma carboxylation activity of vitamin K. So basically, they're just antagonists of vitamin K. Just keep that in mind. I mean, they may have asked something about that, but I feel like it wasn't asked. So now on to this one. The things to know here, not really so much about like what copper is responsible for. That stuff's not important. The thing that's important is Menkes syndrome and Wilson disease. So what is Menkes? Okay, what is a deficiency of an ATP-dependent membrane transporter of copper? So know that's Menkes syndrome. Copper deficiencies characterized by microcytic hyperchromic anemia, and all these other things. Make sure you know that along with Menkes. Okay, just know it. Wilson disease. The thing that really clues you into that is just excess accumulation of copper. That's what you get with Wilson's disease. But what's wrong in Wilson's disease? You have this kidney copper transporter um, is impaired, and therefore you're no longer able to excrete copper from kidneys, and therefore it just accumulates right everywhere. Makes sense. Now, where does it accumulate? Mainly in the brain, the liver, and the kidneys. Um, and of course, with that Johnny recalled my memory, the arrow is pointing down on the M, so it's low copper. That's a good idea. I like that. Wilson has a middle arrow pointing up, so it accumulates. Oh, yeah, I actually kind of like that. that does help make sense a lot. So yeah, Menkes is a deficiency, right? So it's down, so you don't have enough copper. But then Wilson is too much. So yeah, that whole way to memorize that's actually a really good idea. It's awesome. All right, on to the next bits. So the last one. So we're almost there. All right, energy metabolism. So, like I said, I always leave in the objectives for his because I feel like he covers it pretty well. I'm honestly not going to go super in detail for this one because I feel like I'll just tell you what's important from his lecture for the most part because it's honestly just a big picture of what's been going on the entire time, right? Um, Also, if he ever writes anything, make sure you know that that's in what world. So, insulin world has LPL being activated more so because that means it's storing your fat. Um, if there's not a copper transporter, why would it be low blood copper? Oh, okay, so you're talking about Minky. Yeah. So Minky, so you have a deficiency of ATP-dependent membrane transport. Now, the thing that she doesn't really mention is like where this transporter is at. I'm assuming it would be probably in your like intestines, so that way you don't absorb copper. So I would say that's probably why you have low levels of blood copper is because you don't actually absorb enough copper. That'd be my best guess. Yeah, no. Yeah, it's not a blood to tissue transport. I mean, like I said though, it doesn't really mention specific like where this is at. I mean, I guess it could be. I guess. I mean, honestly, I guess it just depends, right? Like, I mean, if you're talking about a specific tissue, since it doesn't really mention a very specific tissue where this is occurring, I would think it's probably more of an absorption issue. So that's why I think it's that way. But yeah, I mean, I guess it could also be that way as well. But yeah, that'd be my best guess. Um, yeah, so interesting thing to note actually. So I actually knew somebody. She unfortunately died a couple days ago. She somebody I went to undergrad with. She actually had Wilson's disease, and she had quite a bit of like neurological damage and everything from that, um, because they didn't catch it quick enough. So actually, it's one of those diseases that if you catch quick enough, won't really cause you much of an issue because they kind of have ways around it. So how to get rid of like excess copper, but unfortunately she wasn't so lucky. She ended up having like quite a bit of neurological damage, so she couldn't really walk or communicate very well and stuff. It was very sad. It was somebody that I personally knew. She was in my pre-cal class and everything. So it was very odd. Just one day, she just kind of like changed. Like it just happened very quickly. So just keep in mind that like these people they do exist out there. Um, it's just like you don't always hear about it. Um, but yeah, so it's something to keep in mind. Like you're making a difference. So that's something to keep in mind, guys. But yeah, it's no big deal, guys. I mean, like I wasn't like super great friends with her, so it didn't affect me a whole lot. But of course, it affected the family a whole lot. Um, it's sad to really see her go downhill and everything. But yeah, gives you a nice big picture of why we're all here. But anyway, so on to just a little bit to finish this off. So yeah, so I think these pictures are very very useful. Tells you exactly um, like what's going on with carbs. So that's actually differences between these different arrow colors. If you notice, right, green is going to be more so like your carb type things, right? What's going on? Your fat type things. So what's going on is more like these orangish color. Um, in protein, honestly, there's not a whole lot that goes on here with that. Really, the only thing protein going on is this whole amino acids, right? You get it from your diet, gets turned into protein within the muscle. That's honestly all that really goes on in insulin world with protein. Now in glucagon world, you get a little bit more, and even then, he doesn't really show a whole lot about protein broken down because he's kind of already covered it, right? So there's no reason for him to really go into much detail with protein breakdown. But if you notice, right, you have alanine, which is like that, how it gets from the muscle to the liver itself. So if you guys kind of remember that from my last session, if you guys were there. But anyway, so alanine gets there, gets broken down to urea, then the rest of that protein is able to be formed into glucose, and therefore, do this whole process basically. But of course, that's going to be like way further along, so that's going to be like super starving. So you wouldn't really have that happen very often. HSL, so notice HSL is activated instead of LPL. So LPL is going to be more so for absorption of fat, while HSL is going to be more breakdown of fat. So that's why you have, so HSL would honestly be like happening in this process right here, right, from fat to fatty acids. So that's where that would be taking place. But they're very helpful because it gives you like a very good picture of what's going on everywhere. So they're very, very helpful, but they are also high yield. So just make sure you have just a general idea of what's going on. Now these dirty dozen ones that he refers to, these are going to be the enzymes that you need to know when they're activated and kind of what their job is. That's the ones that he likes to ask about with this section. So make sure you know all of these when they're activated. So whether you're in insulin world or glucagon world, know like what process they're kind of a part of. So whether it's like fat or protein or whatnot, and just what it means if it's not working. Like just the general knowledge about each of these. And then, so this is always important to know. It kind of helps you kind of distinguish things. So notice that this is like fuel use in the brain specifically. So it's not going to really refer to fat in this because your brain can't really use fat, right? But anyway, so the very first thing you're going to have is those glycogen stores go down within a day, right? So 24 hours, glycogen stores are gone. Okay. Now, what happens after that 24 hours is going to be mainly gluconeogenesis for the first week. Okay. So that's going to be happening for the most part. And then, this is of course if you have no intake at all. So this would be during fasting and starvation. So once a week hits, then you're going to be getting more ketones, and you're you always need glucose from gluconeogenesis because not only does your brain need glucose still, to some degree, but your RBCs or your red blood cells also need glucose as well because they can only use glucose. They can't use ketones at all. So you'd still always need glucose being made from gluconeogenesis, but you would do mainly ketones in terms of energy. So that's where that comes from. Now, I left these in here because I thought it may like trigger something in your mind to kind of remember the difference between, and we covered this in that lecture where we talk about the whole homocysteinuria type thing. So I do have that mentioned in the notes on that slide. So make sure to look at those if you guys are confused on that. But anyway, so this tells you the difference, right? If you have high methylmalonic acid, then that automatically tells you that's vitamin B12 deficiency. Like pretty much no matter what, because that's like vitamin B12 is used in that process to get rid of methylmalonic acid. So that's why if you have vitamin B12 deficiency, you have that. And of course, you would also have these as well. So you'd have megaloblastic anemia and you'd have homocysteinuria. All right, but if it's not high in the urine, then you have no B12 deficiency, but instead you have folic acid deficiency. Okay. And then megaloblastic anemia. Now, the reason that you can kind of say that is because, and it's in a way this diagram is kind of backwards, right? Because you already know they have megaloblastic anemia, but if it's high, if you have methylmalonic acids high, then you know it must be B12. But if you have megaloblastic anemia and it's not high, then it must be folic acid deficiency. So that's what they're trying to say. But I thought it might help you, so I kept it in there. Vitamin B12 versus B6 versus folate. Okay, and this is, once again, something to keep you straight, keep you grounded. So I decided to include it. But once again, we kind of already talked about it, but I don't want to go too much into detail about that. But yeah, I think that's it, guys. So if you haven't already, let me go ahead and copy this attendance thing into chat. Again, I'd really appreciate you guys signing it if you guys haven't already done that. Also, I'm going to put my phone number within the chat so you guys can jot that down. If you ever want to text, I'm always available for that. If you want to message me on Facebook, I try my best to answer it as best I can. And of course, it's all on my phone anyway. You can always email me too at logan.shaver. Don't have any numbers or anything, so it's a pretty simple email. But yeah, so if you guys have any questions, by all means, reach out to me. Yeah, no problem. Oh, and by the way, so this has been recorded as well. So if you guys want to go back on it, by all means, you can.